Unit 2, and I want to look at what tools we'll be using to teach this, what the TEKs are, how we're going to progress through this unit for our student learning. So first, we are going to use place value to compare whole numbers up to 120 using comparative language. That's very similar to the kindergarten standard. Kindergartners compared numbers using comparative language also. Definitely not up to 120, but that was their standard as far as comparative language. They did not use the inequality symbols in kindergarten either. We will do 1.2F, which is ordering whole numbers up to 120 using place value and open number lines. And then 1.2G is our readiness standard for this unit, where we will represent the comparison of two numbers up to 100 using the inequality symbols greater than, less than, or equal to. So that is new for first grade. Kindergarten does not introduce the symbols. They only match our 1.2E with comparative language. So lots of tools that we'll want to use during this unit, and we will look at that together for each part of the learning progression. So I just snipped the learning progression for us and put it across the bottom so we could talk through how we will work through these TEKs and what learning order makes sense for our students. So to start with, we will be looking at a visual comparison with manipulatives, then with a balance scale before we introduce the inequality symbols. And then we will talk about comparing and ordering on a number line before we worry about an open number line. So let's talk about a visual comparison with manipulatives. Now, this is going to be a continuation of our place value unit that we just wrapped up. Unit 1 was a big intro for first grade where they learned what base 10 blocks are. And it may be wise for you, if you have students who are still struggling with base 10 blocks, to continue to carry forward that learning with linking cubes. So building a 10 is fine with linking cubes like we talked about with Unit 1, but we do want to progress our students to understanding that a rod represents 10, and we want to call it by its number name. We don't want to say, grab a rod, grab a unit, grab a flat. We want to call it by its value. So we want to make sure that we are comparing numbers using manipulatives also. So we may compare with whole numbers with linking cubes. We could compare them with base 10 blocks. We could compare with counters. We can compare with all sorts of things when we're just comparing numbers. So a couple of samples for you to look at is we may give a problem like sample 1 where students are given two place value models and asked to compare them. Now, when you're introducing this, we would introduce this with comparative language. So we would look at this and we would figure out that the first value is 35 and the second value is 44. And then we could ask students visually to compare them, which has more. And one of the things that we have to watch out with kids is we want to just count up and say they're the same because, oh, I lost my mouse, because both of them use 8 blocks. So that's where we have to talk about the value, and that's where we tie back to our place value unit, that the first one represents 35 because each of the green rods is 10. So we would have to figure out that it's not just 8 blocks that we're talking about, but what is the value of them? So then we could talk about 35 compared to 44, and we would be able to say 35 is less than 44. And then remember, we want kids to say that inequality both ways. So 35 is less than 44, and 44 is greater than 35. We're fine to be able to also say more than instead of greater than, or in addition to greater than, and fewer than. So we want to make sure we're using all of those terms when we're describing a comparison between two values. We may also see things like sample 2, where we're given a word problem kind of information, where we're just asked who has more, and then we're still just comparing two whole numbers within the confines of our TEK, but we're able to look at it in more than just a visual. So in this one, we're asking students to draw a place value model of each number and then compare the numbers. So that's another way that they can compare using manipulatives. In one case, it's the manipulatives are given to them. In another case, they're asked to draw those, which ties with Unit 1 that we've been working with. The other thing that we can do to help students that need to see a little bit more of a visual is pull out those balance scales. They're in your science lab. So when you use those during science, we're going to use those to compare in math as well. Now, what we have to remember is we're going to use objects that are all the same size and weight. So we don't want to put some tens and some ones together because that's not going to necessarily always give you the right answer to your problem. So we want to make sure that we're using things that all are the same size and same weight. So in this kind of a visual, you're going to want to use smaller numbers because we don't want students to sit and count out 73 unit cubes and 97 unit cubes to compare. You can use smaller numbers to get the point across and allow them to see the visual. And then I've also seen teachers that have the symbols on a piece of cardstock. And then once they build the model in the balance scale, then they use the cardstock and they tape it right here to the middle of the scale so that students can see the heavier one is going to weight down the scale. The lighter one is going to go up higher. The heavier one is going to go down lower. Or if they're at the same, then they're equal. And so they're able to see that visual comparison that way as well. So the big takeaway with that, make sure everything has the same size and same weight when you start comparing them. The little unit cubes like pictured here are great. Base 10 units are great as well, as long as you're only using units. Just don't mix units with tens. You can use counters. You could use teddy bear counters if they're all the same size. You could use the 1-inch cubes, anything you need to be able to make that comparison as long as they're the same size and same weight. Then the next thing we want to talk about is when we're introducing the inequality symbols. And I showed you guys this graphic as kind of a little funny haha reminder. We don't teach alligators to remember what the symbols mean. We just teach them what the symbols mean. So just like we don't teach funny games to remember what an addition sign is or a subtraction sign or an equal sign, we don't need to teach tricks to remember what the inequality symbols mean. So we're going to just teach kids, this is what the greater than symbol looks like. This is what the less than symbol looks like. And again, we can use greater than or more than, and less than or fewer than. So we want to hear all of those terms when we're relating to this, because that's what they're going to hear in real life. They're not always going to say greater than, less than. You're going to hear fewer, you're going to hear more. There are comparative words besides greater than, less than. So we want to use those with our students as well. So when we're writing these, we want to, again, make sure that if we're asking students to write a comparison statement, we want to make sure that we're varying what they see and what they hear. So make sure we're not always writing such so that it's a greater than answer, or always writing so that it's a less than answer. So we want to make sure we're varying that when we're providing kids those problems. And again, have the opportunity to build that as well as using the numbers and comparing, and talk to them about comparing the tens place because that's the largest place. So if we went back to our example here, we could see that 44 is larger because 4 tens is more than 3 tens. So we have to make sure we're having that conversation with kiddos. Okay, once we're starting to understand comparing just two numbers, then we're going to move to comparing and ordering on a number line. So initially, we want to put these things on a number line like those that I have drawn here, and obviously more specific number lines with more than just counting by tens. And we do this because it's easier to see visually on a number line when there are just a couple of numbers. So, and when there are tick marks. So we're going to start with a standard number line, and we would be able to find the two numbers that we're comparing on the number line. And then our instruction would be, we can look at this number is closer to 0 than this number. So the one that's closest to 0 is smaller. The one that's farther away from 0 is the larger number. So we can also bring in those position words that you talk about in science, where you're talking about numbers or before, or things that are before or after or beside. a number line relates really well to that. So those are good position words to talk about. Kids typically do better with comparing and ordering when we introduce it on a number line that has the numbers on it first before we introduce an open number line. So we would move to an open number line, and that means we are not giving them any tick marks. We're not putting any numbers on the number line. We are only giving them a line. And that's a lot. That's very abstract for a student, a 6-year-old student, especially. So think about how that would feel to you if you had never done that before. So we're not going to start out with tough numbers. We're going to start out with numbers maybe from 0 to 10 and talk about where would you put 0 on this number line? And if 10 was our biggest number, where would you put 10 on this number line? Then we could talk about where would you put 8? And it's a great formative assessment to see what your kids do with that information. If I've put 0 and 10, I'm interested to know, does a student understand that 8 is closer to 10 than it is to 0? So do we have that magnitude understanding yet of where do numbers belong and how do they relate to each other? So it allows us to build some understanding. It allows us to see what kids understand. So maybe an activity that you could do is if you just draw a long number line on your whiteboard and put 0 at one end and maybe 20 at the other end, and give everybody a sticky note that has a number on it, and see where would they put it on this number line? Where do they think it goes? Can they put their number in the right, or not necessarily in the right order yet, but do they know where in position it goes? Closer to 0, closer to 20? Is it the middle? What understanding have they built? And then when they've started doing that, then you could have 3 kids maybe come up and put their sticky note in order. So that starts building us toward using an open number line to order numbers. So in first grade, we do have to be able to put numbers in order on an open number line. And we typically do that with 3 numbers. So like this example would say, use the number line to order 26, 51, and 119. I typed them in order. You would not. I didn't think that I did that. I must not have gone back and corrected it. So you would not put them in order when you give them the list of numbers to put in order. So you could, but it might not do you much good. So you would want to mix those numbers up. And then you want to see, are they putting them positionally? Are they putting ones that should be close together, close together? Or are they putting ones that should be farther apart, farther apart? So what are they doing with those numbers in addition to just putting them on a number line? Are they just sticking them in a spot, or do they have some sort of positional understanding of our number system? So those are the big ideas for comparing and ordering. We are going to make sure we are, hold on, I missed a spot. We are going to make sure we are using linking cubes, base 10 blocks, balance scales, pulling out a hundreds chart and allowing students to look at that hundreds chart and start recognizing the patterns that we've been working with place value is a great way to help students compare numbers. So if I pull a hundreds chart up and I'm able to look at 2 numbers, it's similar to a number line. The ones that are closest to 0 are smaller than the ones that are closest to 100. And then I've seen teachers take that hundreds chart and cut them apart and line it up so that they build that to move towards a number line. So they can see, oh, the numbers are just in order. And they're able to use that to find numbers and compare numbers. So linking cubes, base 10 blocks, balance scales, any kind of counters that you need to use to be able. And then hundreds charts, number lines, and then lastly, open number lines. Those are the toughest ones for our kids. And so that's how we're going to scaffold our learning for this. We're going to make sure when we are asking kids to put 3 numbers in order, we're going to make sure, first of all, that we tell them, are we doing greatest to least or least to greatest? We need to vary that so that there's some kind of examples for them so they're not just always seeing the same thing. And I feel like that probably takes care of just about everything for comparing whole numbers. Remember that you're going to want to use the mission math activities for this. There are great activities for this unit. So look toward mission math, that 5E model when you're ready for your CFA. That's going to be your evaluate phase of the mission math 5E model, so you'll use evaluate for that. Then you are going to want to look at the engaging math, both volume 1 and 2. So volume 1 is a new one that you just got this year, and that's got some great activities in it. And then also AIR has got some good activities in it. So those are your main resources that you will use. All right, you've got 14 days for this unit. You've got your calendar that I've put on the Google shared drive that shows you how I would lay out the mission math part of the unit to kind of pace out that 5E model. And then you're able to pull in some of the other resources on the in-between days. So that is 14 days that we have for that unit.